So I told you I'd make a short little video on how these clutches work because there's just a lot of confusion in them, and there's a lot of different little parts, and if you don't understand how they work and how they correspond to each other, then it gets a little confusing and you don't really know what to do. So I'm going to go over the parts real quick and we'll get going. So I laid all the parts out here, as you can see, so we'll start with this. So this is your clutch arm, right? It's inside its little housing. You can kind of see a little flat spot there where it's shiny. I call this the clutch arm or the actuator, and as you can see here, I've got several things holding my little example cable in. I like to run a few extra of these just so you know it doesn't damage your cable as much, and it's a lot more surface area to grab the cable with, so it's guaranteed not to slip. That's one issue I found early on, and anyhow. And then right after that, you got your bucking bar and your bearings. So this is your bucking bar. It's like a piece of carbide or something hardened, and it goes right up in here like that. And the clutch actuator pushes on it like so, and so you can see it turning like that. That's what pushes on the carbide, and that actually pushes on this bearing or marble, probably just a bearing you could call it. And so that bearing goes inside here into the clutch shaft assembly. So you can kind of see it in there. Hold on. Anyhow, that's the bucking bar and the bearing. Next you have your clutch shaft assembly, which has multiple parts in it. You can see right here on the sides, there's one there and one there. That's where your keyways go. And this is your keyways, or half moons. Some people just call them keys. That's where those go. But this entire assembly is multiple parts, which I'll take one apart here in a minute. And then after that, on each side of your shaft, you have a bearing. So that's what these are, your bearings, and they're a 6202 RS. And they don't get their inner caps taken off when you run them on the clutch assembly there. Next you have your clutch basket. That's just what I call it. You know, it's just is what it is. It's one whole assembly of a few different parts. It's got bearings on the inside there. I haven't taken one of those apart yet, but it's definitely on the to-do list. After that, you know, you got your clutch pads. Your clutch pads just go inside the little slots there. They're kind of a tight fit, or need to be a perfect fit really, with maybe even a little loose so they push on the back as the pressure plate hits. But next you got your spring, which sits right there. And now I'm missing a few parts here because it's not assembled, but there's a washer that goes right here, and then a bolt, and it's I believe a 15 or a 16 millimeter bolt, and I have them. We'll assemble one of these here in a minute, but I'm just going over the parts. So anyhow, you got your clutch spring. Then here's your pressure plate, you know, so you'd have all your clutch pads in there. Your pressure plate would go over it like this. Let's see here. And then after that, you'd have your flower nut and locking screw. So your flower nut would go like that. Your locking screw there. By the way, the locking screws in these are an M4.70, which is actually the same size as these screws right here. Both of them are metric, and it's an M4.70. I figured I'd go over that. Again, we have our keyways, and then this piece here is specifically, I like to call it the pressure plate. You know, it applies pressure onto your clutch pads. Anyhow, yeah, so that's basically all of that. And then as soon as I find it, here it is. So specifically, the clutch shaft is an assembly of multiple parts. You got your shaft, your spring, your actuator, your tensioner clasp, your spring seat, and your locking pin. So I'm just going to set this here for a second, lock you guys in so you can watch, but we're going to take one of these apart real quick just so you can see what's all in it. So starting with the outside, right? So you get your spring, that's your spring seat, and this is your spring, I like to call it the preload nut, or tensioner clasp, as I mentioned, referred to it on the paper. So this comes apart like this, and I'm already pre-loosened it so I can make sure it comes apart easy. I don't want to be sitting here with pliers trying to pry it apart. So this comes apart. This is what would hold your spring in place. Then after that, your spring comes out. Come on, I'm trying to get it to come apart without separating everything else quickly. So then your spring comes apart. And after that, you got this inside shaft in here, and right at the seat there's a locking pin. Now, I'm going to show you how this works all together, right? So your flower nut would be right here. Your flower nut pulls on it, and that's what tightens or puts the preload on your spring. Now, a lot of people don't understand this, but this is multiple functions happening at once. So I'm going to put this into the bucking bar real quick and pretend it's assembled. Now watch what happens when you push on your bucking bar. You're actually pushing on the entire assembly and it's moving it, right? Makes sense. It's moving the assembly. Now, when you add tension onto your flower nut and onto the spring, you're actually shortening the stroke of the actuator inside the clutch assembly. So we're going to tighten up this flower nut and just pretend that it's tightening up the spring. So I got a little bit of tension on it, and I'm going to draw it in real quick. It would probably be drawn out to here, right? So as you tension your flower nut, it's actually shortening the stroke of the bucking bar. So when you bring in your bucking bar, it's actually pulling the bucking bar away from the actuator itself. So you'd actually have to have more distance forward in your actuator for the bucking bar to reach the actual. The actuator would have to, the bucking bar has to be longer essentially if you draw in too much on your flower nut. But that's for another part of this video here in a minute when we go outside and start adjusting stuff, which we'll do a virtual thing on. So one moment as I fix this. Okay. Drop this up. I'll get the marble in a minute. Okay, anyhow, let me reassemble this so it makes sense, so when we take it apart you guys can see everything. So this actuator is inside of the clutch assembly, and it's held in by this locking pin, which actually goes through, come on, it's being a pain in the butt. One moment. Trying to get this together here. So the pin goes through right here, goes into the actuator, which is held on by the seat, and the spring actually holds it together. So you can see where the flower nut would be, how it pulls on the spring seat through the actuator. So to take this all apart, you simply just got to drop out the pin, which then releases the actuator, and then the spring seat comes off. So now you can see that there's a slot, your actuator pin, where the flower nut would go, and just the empty shaft housing now. Now to put this all back together, you're going to put your actuator pin back in, you're going to line up the hole like that. You're going to take your spring seat, no, wrong one, spring seat, which is just a metal piece that takes the pin. You're going to run that back in, line it up, and you're going to take your locking pin, you're going to drop it down through, you're going to make sure it pops out the other side, right? Okay, so we got the locking pin in. Just rest it like that. Then you're going to take your spring. I don't know how well this camera is viewing this, but it should be wide view. You're going to take your hardened spring and you're going to drop that in place. That spring is going to hold the locking pin together. Then you're going to take your tensioner clasp. You're going to tighten that back onto it. Forgot the name there for a second. A lot of terminology here. You're going to tighten that back up. Now, when you tighten this up, essentially, you want this shaft to have just right at the base of those threads. You can kind of see it there where those threads start, and I don't have pliers with me right now to tighten this one up because it's actually quite the challenge. This spring has a lot of spring load in it, so you're going to need 2 sets of pliers to hold this and turn it. But you just want it right at the base. You don't want any more than that because that's plenty of preload to work with your clutch assembly when you go to assemble it. Now I'm going to give you guys a very light assembly in an empty case that I have right here, just for just so you can see it. So you start with the empty case. You put your bearings in on each side, which we're not going to do that right now because I don't have a press here, and maybe I'll make a separate video just for that. So your flower nut always goes on your clutch side. So pretend it's got bearings in there. Now I'm going to show you, right? So you'd have your drive sprocket over here, your clutch assembly here. So I'll just start lightly assembling it, but we're going to focus on this side. So then your clutch assembly here. Now your keys always need to go in your shafts, right? So you drop your keyway in your shaft. You take your clutch basket here, run that over your shaft. Come on. You can see that the key's kind of locking into the assembly there. And then on this side you would have your spring goes like that. You'd bolt it in place. You'd have all your clutch pads in. You push this down, tighten up this, and I'll give a specific video just for actual assembly and everything. It'll be the other half of this video, or maybe another one, we'll see. And then over here, my marble hit the floor. Oh, 1 second. Then this specifically goes in this end of the shaft like that. I don't know if you guys saw that or not. So the bearing goes in the shaft. Now mind you, this needs like some grease, and I'll show you guys how to grease this entire shaft because the whole assembly needs grease. It's all metal on metal. And then your carbide bucking bar goes in there like that, and then after that it would be your clutch actuator, and you bolt that on the outside like this, and then this clutch actuator, when it's pulled, that's what actuates the clutch and pushes on the pressure plate to release the clutch. And then when you let off of your clutch and it releases this way, the pressure plate actually comes back onto the clutch pads, and that's actually what drives the motion forward, is when this pressure plate comes back on your clutch pads. But so I hope that first part of this video makes sense. If there's any questions, I have no problem going back through and answering them, or giving a better demonstration on specific parts, or anything. These videos are pretty quick, but let's go outside and actually have an engine running and make some adjustments. Alright guys, so just a quick little assembly video on how to lube up the clutch shaft and all the parts on the inside of it, because if you know anything about internal combustion engines or anything that has to do with metal on metal, you're going to have the best results when you make sure your product that you're working with has good lubrication, because not only is it going to allow your parts to move better and give you less hang-ups or whatever could possibly happen, but it's also going to make your parts run cooler and have less issues overall in the long term and longevity of your parts. So let's get started with, this is your actuator shaft, and it runs in the inside of this, metal on metal, and I absolutely make sure that this part has lubrication all the way through it, because if your clutch shaft doesn't and it starts hanging up for whatever reason, your clutch is stuck open, your clutch is stuck shut, who knows what it's doing. You just want to make sure that you take some sort of grease. Now this is a wheel bearing grease that I love. It's a high temp red. It's probably what I swear by. It's the only stuff I'll buy. And so anyway, and this is a lot of grease. You don't need this much. I'm just gonna spew some on here and you know, put it on here, put it in, and run it around inside there. So anyhow, you take it like that. I'm gonna get some of that grease on the inside of here. Take your excess off. You don't need a lot. Just get it down in there. You can take your bucking bar, push it down through. It'll help you get it all lubed up. Anyway, you just want this entire shaft to have some grease on it, and then some grease running through the entire assembly. Come on. Grab that bucking bar and push it through. Okay. Now, come on. Gotta have one part coming out while the other part's coming out. Makes it pain in the butt. Okay. So this shaft here, your actuator, the threads go on the threaded end. All right. I don't know if anybody's going to remember that, but the way you can tell is the part where your actual bucking bar goes is kind of flat and square, and the part where your flower nut piece goes has actually got a little bit of a taper to it. So you're going to run your threaded part next to on the same side as your actuator tensioner would go. So make sure you got a little bit of lubrication in there. Got her all good to go. Next, you're going to grab your spring seat. You're going to bring that down. Wrong side. You're going to bring that onto your shaft here. Then you're going to grab your locking pin. You're going to lock your bucking bar in place. Remember what we talked about earlier, where you're going to line up the pin, has to go all the way through. Just give it a feel, make sure it feels good. Then you're going to take your spring, you're going to put your spring on here. Now these parts don't need lubed on the outside. You're going to add a little lubrication to them later when we go to assemble in the case. Okay, make sure that runs up and down. Come on. Spring's clocked a little weird, it's kind of funky. Fix that. Okay, and then you're going to take your locking nut or tensioner nut, actuator, whatever you want to call it. And you're going to tighten that up. And then on this side, where your little bearing goes, you're going to take just a little finger of grease. Not a ton, because grease actually acts like a hydraulic. You can't compress it. So it's going to try and squeeze some out. But you're going to press your bearing in there. Then you're going to take your carbide chunk, your bucking bar, and just press it in there. Now you want lubrication all the way on this thing, because a lot of people don't understand that this thing spins inside this. So your entire assembly is spinning with your motor, and this has to sit there stationary while your clutch is pulled in, just like that. And if it's not lubed, guess what? Metal on metal gets hot, and it's going to burn up your carbide. It's going to damage your clutch shaft, and you're probably going to have to buy a new one, because it just eats it up. It really doesn't take long. Anyhow, so that's how you lube your entire shaft here. Those are the parts you want lubed, just on the inside of your shaft assembly there, and your carbide and your marble. Just want to make sure those are nice and lubed and good to go. And this is a maintenance item. This isn't just lube it once and you're good for the rest of your bike's life. This is, you need to lube this thing probably once a month. If you're riding in rain, your chain's running through there, you know, your chains get dirty and stuff, I would lube this, hell, I would even go as far as once a week, because this piece really has its own longevity, its own life, and if you're not taking care of it, you're going to have to get a new one. Now, I carry these, I make sure I have at least 5-10 on me at all times, because they go out. People forget to lube them, so this is an important part to make sure that you're not forgetting the lubrication. But anyhow, that's just the clutch assembly and how to lube it. Super simple stuff as long as you take care of it. Another thing about this is you can actually knock one of these out of your case without having to remove your engine off your bike. And I'll show you guys an example of that. It's super easy to do. Just takes a good size hammer. You can knock it out of your bike within seconds. You just take it apart. It will come right out. Yeah, so let's get on to the next part of this video. One thing I forgot to bring up is how to remove clutch pads if they're being a real pain in the butt on removal. So sometimes you're going to get some clutch pads that came from China that are just stiff and don't want to come out. So what I do is I take a flat blade and I'll just get in here and I'll just find a point to pry, right? So you're going to pry, and however you end up doing it, right? So sometimes you can go in on the back and just loosen them up a little and then come back over here, pry it out. They usually come out pretty quick, pretty easy. This one's kind of being a little more pain, so I'll come back behind it and I'll go back to the front, right? So you just pry on both sides a little bit. Typically they come right out. You can even pry to the side. Sometimes even the side will let it pop out fairly quickly. You don't want to damage them too much. This one's going to be in a pain, but you get the idea. They come right out fairly easily. These are non-broken. This is a brand new engine. As you can see, I got engines everywhere. I was digging for a piston I needed before a race and haven't put nothing away yet. But you get the idea. That's how you pop the clutch pads out. Real simple and easy.